Okay, quick bit of context. This was originally a part of a discussion on Shadows of Evil, video coming soon, but I decided that 1, it was too long and kind of breaking up the flow of that video, and 2, what I was talking about was bigger than the implementation on just that one map. There were a lot of big design decisions being made here, and it's worth looking at them holistically and not limited to how they affect only shadows. So this is hopefully going to be a shorter video focusing on just the big engine level changes made for Black Ops 3. The jump from Black Ops 2 to 3 was the biggest full overhaul the mode had ever gotten. Up until this point, it had felt like a very iterative process, with most of the innovation happening on a map-to-map level. The game itself felt more like it was just a vehicle to bring those maps to you. There were little touches made along the way, the biggest being things like the self-revive capability being added to quick revive, or transit codifying buildables as a mechanic, but for the most part, they were usually minor improvements, just consequences of being part of a newer and shinier game. With Black Ops 3 though, a lot of very intentional changes to a bunch of different systems all added up and caused a pretty fundamental shift in how the game was played. The big one that's the most omnipresent and the most woven into every aspect of the gameplay is the new system of Gobblegums. By the release of Black Ops 3, we had already fully entered what I'd call the second era of monetization for Call of Duty. Instead of the first model, where the only revenue was from the sales of the main game and then the big DLC map packs, over time each entry had started adding an in-game store where you could spend smaller amounts of money anytime over the game's lifecycle to get other in-game products. It started out with just cosmetic items like weapon camos or character skins, but in Ghosts and Advanced Warfare they made the controversial change to start putting gameplay relevant items in the stores, like new guns. That of course continued into Black Ops 3, where those microtransactions first touched the zombie side of things. So, on every map in the game, there were these gumball machines that you could hit for points like a mystery box, and get a random ability out of a predetermined pack that you set up before the game started. Half of them were the classic Gobblegums, which just unlocked naturally as you leveled up. These ones already had some pretty useful effects, but they were balanced out really well by being very temporary. You had things like massively increasing your melee damage, but only for a set amount of time, or 2 uses of basically on-demand zombie blood, or temporarily letting you convert points into ammo to refill your reserves. The real reason the mechanic was actually implemented though was to be able to push the other category of Gobblegums, the Megas. Instead of just being available to put in your pack right from the start, or getting unlocked over time, these ones you had to spend in-game currency to get. You earned a little bit by playing the game, enough to get maybe a couple a day, but of course you could buy way more if you spent real money. And, following the supply drop model, you couldn't just outright buy the ones you wanted either. First, you had to spin a slot out of game to try to get lucky and get the ones you wanted to be able to even put them in your pack before you can jump into a game and get them out of that machine there. What made this a self-sustaining model was that, unlike classics, Megas were consumable. For example, when you got 1 raindrops in Dr. Monty's factory, you actually got 1. You could put it in your pack and get it from a gumball machine and get the effect, but then after that, you can't get it again until you get another copy from the store. Even setting aside the pretty rough microtransaction layer and just looking at it purely in terms of game design, there are still some fundamental problems with the Gobblegum mechanic. The classics I actually think are great. They add a new facet to the gameplay and give the player more tools for their toolkit, but they're balanced out by being so situational and non-permanent. I don't think most people would say that Black Ops 3 is across the board an easy game, even though these are all accessible to anyone who wants them, so obviously they're not completely unbalanced. Because they wanted to convince people to spend their actual money on the Megas though, on average those are a lot more powerful and, in more than one case, completely game-breaking. You had things like instantly reviving every other player in the lobby regardless of distance, or spawning every single drop on demand whenever you wanted. Or the Holy Grail, automatically get every perk in the game for free, ignoring the traditional perk limit. For one, I think that when players use these, they can miss some of the intricacies of map design that make Zombies so special. It doesn't matter where the developers physically place the perk machines on the map, or if there's an interesting progression to unlocking Pack-a-Punch, if players are just using Gobblegums to skip those processes entirely. For example, take one of my favorite maps, Call of the Dead. One of your first goals is, of course, to get Juggernog, and to do that, you have to go down into the bottom of an old, rusted ship. It's this darker, echoey area, and at the very bottom, you're forced to wade across a pool of freezing water, which slows you down and lets the zombies catch up. It really works to make you feel like you're right there on that desperate journey for survival, really conveying that feeling of being cold and alone. Then, right when the character and the player are both at their lowest point, you turn a corner and you see the light at the end of the tunnel, this bright, red-hued perk machine that stands out in this cold environment and almost warms you up just to look at it, and you know it'll make you stronger and give you a fighting chance. So my problem is partially with the gameplay progression side of it all, how it always feels better to work your way up to an overpowered state than it does to flip a switch and just get there for free. But it's also about those journeys and how being funneled in certain directions for gameplay reasons can help reinforce the vibe of the map or tell little stories like that. There's no real reason to go back inside the shipwreck on Call of the Dead once you already have Juggernog, and even if there was, that trip loses a lot of the tension and impact if you have the perk and you don't feel that stress of knowing your game can end with 2 quick hits. If this was Black Ops 3 and you could just pop a perkaholic right off spawn, the developers wouldn't be able to give a lot of people that feeling. I think this might actually be a small part of the reason why every map in this game feels so varied from the next, and they all feel like they're in completely different genres from one another. You have Shadows of Evil with the Lovecraftian cosmic horror, to Der Eisendrache's fantasy elements, to the Gorod Krovi heavy metal vibe. Before, the developers could make a new map feel very fresh with a distinct setup process, or first-time traversal method. Since players were given the option to work around some of that gameplay stuff now, the setting and atmosphere was one thing that they could really hone and still make sure that every player felt equally. The other thing to point out was that Gobblegums were basically the last nail in the coffin for public lobbies. Now, obviously, they had always had their problems with things like the pack-a-punch methods where you had to communicate with randoms to convince them to help you out, or just general bad etiquette like point hoarding and the Mexican standoff of figuring out who was going to buy the next door. This was really the straw that broke the camel's back, because now we were at a point where a single player could open the entire map for free or just skip entire rounds, and there was nothing you could do about it. One player could single-handedly choose to completely break the progression of the gameplay loop for everyone else in the lobby, so if you wanted to play just a good old-fashioned game of zombies, the only way to guarantee that was to avoid randoms. Not only that, but because of the way the game calculated Gobblegum consumption, if you shut your console off before the game officially ended, you'd be able to keep your consumable megas even if you used them in that game. So, you'd have people that would pop a perkaholic at the beginning of the game, and then at the first sign of trouble, they'd panic and instantly disconnect, leaving you alone having basically wasted all that time matchmaking. The other big new mechanic for Black Ops 3 was the double pack-a-punch system. In the last game, you could pay a little extra to swap out attachments on some guns, which wasn't really game-changing and was more just a convenience thing. Here, that was expanded to a way more realized feature with alternate ammo types. When you pack-a-punched most weapons for the second time, they got some kind of modifier attached to them. Then, later, as you're going about your game firing your usual shots into a horde, one of your bullets will trigger some additional effect. Some of them imitated wonder weapons from the past, with Thunderwall turning single bullets into thundergun shots, or Blast Furnace emulating the Fire Staff, or Deadwire being basically a mini Wunderwaffe. The other ones were more out there, with fireworks turning the zombie taking the shot into a bomb, or turned making that zombie into an ally fighting for you. I think the direction of adding depth via new upgrade paths like this is a good one to explore, although I do wish in this case they were a little more expensive given how powerful they were. What's a little confusing though is how they seem to fundamentally conflict with where the developers were trying to take the mode everywhere else. The trend that started with Origins was a move to that more quest-based design ethos. Instead of the wonder weapon just being in the box like the old days, now getting any upgrade like that involved doing some multi-step fetch quest and really putting in the work and earning all your rewards. But why would you put all that work into building the Apothecary Servant if you can just spend 2,500 points and guaranteed get an SMG with something like Deadwire doing infinite damage anyway? It might have been their attempt to put out an olive branch to more casual players, and the decision to make it so those big fetch quests weren't actually necessary was an intentional one, but at that point it's probably better to just commit. With everything else in the mode requiring such heavy investment anyway, this one little affordance didn't really make it all that much more approachable. All it really did was make wonder weapons less valuable and make it so there wasn't really any gameplay motivation to get them. You had to actively want to put the work in even though you knew it wasn't the most efficient use of your time. And since the new, usually overpowered wonder weapon was one of the big draws of a new release historically, players not seeing them as often was another way that maps were in danger of losing their uniqueness and identity. The rest of the changes were smaller by comparison, but there were a few of them. For one, the player health values were tweaked a little bit, so now it took 3 hits to down you without Juggernog instead of 2. Theoretically, this should make the early game a lot easier compared to older entries where your game could just be instantly ended by one zombie getting 2 quick hits in. To balance it out though, the zombie AI was made a lot more aggressive across the board, hitting faster, surrounding the players more tightly, and starting to sprint way earlier. We were also given even more new tools on top of the Gobblegums and the alternate ammo types. A new system that was built into the engine for Black Ops 3's campaign and multiplayer was the specialist weapon mechanic, so zombies piggybacked on top of that and put their own little spin on it. On top of all the wonder weapons, each map also had another buildable item that could be used for a set amount of time before needing to go on cooldown for a while. This one, I think, is just objectively a great mechanic, no complaints here. It was one more thing that gave the mode even more depth, which was one of their main goals from here on out, and was a way for them to give players short bursts of something really powerful without having it be fully consumable in a way that was annoying, like Transit's jet gun breaking. Lastly, outside of the game itself, Zombies now had its own XP and leveling progression, just like multiplayer always had. Leveling up let you use new Gobblegums, as well as unlocking weapon kits. So in a match, you could always use any gun that you bought off the wall or got out of the box, same as always, but if you were a high enough level to have that gun's weapon kit unlocked, you could choose what attachments you wanted applied to it each time you bought it. And finally, with the XP system came challenges. With any system like this, there's always the problem that giving the player a list of things to complete like that turns playing the game just for fun into more of a grind to be able to fill out all those checkboxes. I've always said that I think the strength of Zombies is that it's compelling for its own sake. For 3 full games, the mode was a fan favorite hit even though it didn't give the players a single thing for playing it. It was just fun and engaging enough that playing the game was worth your time. I understand why the developers wanted to add all this for the same reason it's always been in multiplayer. It's just player psychology that those constant dopamine hits and seeing all kinds of numbers going up all the time is a quick way to make sure players keep playing. In my opinion, Zombies has a strong enough formula to not need to take those shortcuts, so I don't love it from the standpoint of the integrity of the design. But at the same time, I can ignore it enough to appreciate that it probably gave some new players some incentive to try out this new mode for themselves and fall in love with it on their own. It's interesting looking at everything laid out like this because it feels like a lot of the changes made for Black Ops 3 at a high level might not have actually been in the right direction. And yet, the maps that were built on top of that foundation are some of the most unique and well-remembered in the entire series. The developers at Treyarch stayed true to that philosophy of always trying to push the envelope and experiment and always try to be doing something new and different. So, even though the game had to strain against itself in a lot of ways, it really overcame those limitations and proved how strong it was by actually ending up being a lot of the community's favorite game even all these years later.